So I'm going to push back on that directly with this.
Oh, we love it. We love
Okay,
it. Yeah, no.
we're going to go ahead and start. If you can hear me in the back, raise your hand.
Yeah,
Cool, thank you.
yeah.
Ooh, great. Good afternoon. How was lunch? Good, excellent. UCLA always has good catering, I'll say that. Very much. I'm Alan Marks. I teach here at the law school and have the privilege of working, oh, thank you. And I see some of my students in the room. And I have the privilege of being affiliated with the Emmett Institute. We've been talking about having people in the public sector here, as well as lawyers and private sector participants. I'm here wearing my UCLA hat. So just a qualifier at the beginning, I'm also the president of the commission that oversees the LA Department of Water and Power, but I am not here in my DWP capacity, nor am I speaking on behalf of the utility. So what I say, if it sounds like an opinion, it's mine alone. So don't blame me for anything, or blame me for everything. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And we have, of course, lots of people at the law school who have more distinguished than mine, public service careers. I see in the front Mary Nichols, Ann Carlson, and I know there's others in the room. So thank you for your service and for keeping the lights on and the skies blue. Today, we have a pretty good panel for panel 2. Our panel is called looking at the transition away from fossil fuels. And I think one of the questions we'll look at in a moment is if that's actually true. If we aren't, instead of in an energy transition, if perhaps we're in an energy expansion at the moment. The first panel focused on the electricity. We are going to go beyond power and look at the broader energy sector, including liquid fuels, and look at how things are moving, given that there are supply shocks, challenges from war, of course, in Iran and the Middle East. There are increases, as we know from the power sector, from this morning's panel, for electricity, which is causing a spike in demand, again, suddenly in some places for coal, believe it or not. And also, of course, continued reliance on natural gas in a very, very big way to meet demand. And not just in the US, but in China, in the rest of Southeast Asia, and around the world. So that's happening at the same time as we are doubling down on investments in clean and renewable energy of all types. Just in the power sector, of course, we can look at the penetration of solar plus storage, and wind, which together account for over 90% of the new installed capacity in the United States for each of the last 5 years. We can look at record investments on that in China, and in Europe, and in Latin America, and elsewhere. And of course, the grids, the transmission systems, and the gas transportation networks, including for LNG, although very much impacted by the Middle East war, that are important parts of the transition away from coal to things that are at least a little cleaner, if not a lot cleaner, in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, where there's large growth in demand, not just from electrification of mobility, not just from AI and data centers, but also from manufacturing, and especially from air conditioning. If you think of, for a moment, how we use energy broadly, these are, you can't just look at one sector. Transportation is energy. Water is energy. Energy is water. And it's all a symptom of land use and how we create economic growth and the abundance which we may or may not be able to do sustainably. So that will be a question for our panelists in a moment. I'm going to have them introduce themselves in a little more detail when they answer their first questions. Next to me is Katie Valenzuela, a policy consultant joining us from Sacramento. David Spence in the middle, joining us from the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor with a background in both political science and law. And at the far end, Ryan Cummings, who is with the Stanford Institute for Economic Policymaking. I think you'll appreciate the multidisciplinary aspect of this as we look at the multi-sector issues facing energy. So Katie, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey to this and also tell us a bit about how environmental justice plays a role in some of these questions.
Sure, and thank you for having me here today. Again, my name's Katie Valenzuela. I use she, her pronouns, and I was born and raised in a little town called Oildale. Who knows where Oildale is? Ah, I know Mary knows. So it's one of the areas of the state where a large part of our extraction and production still occurs. And frankly, it's this reality that we just deal with every day. You didn't know that it was unusual for that not all kids are supposed to have inhalers, or that, when the flares are happening, I used to think they were beautiful at night because it was like this big light in the sky. You didn't know that it was bad for you until I went away and got to school. So now I have the pleasure of being a lobbyist for nonprofits. So I work exclusively for nonprofit organizations. And in this field, I work for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, who works in Kern County to organize communities around a just transition, as well as the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, who's been fighting for cleaner air in the San Joaquin Valley Basin for 20 years. So thank you again for having me today.
Good, thank you, Katie. David, tell us a bit about your journey, and your first question will be about abundance and whether you think that we actually have it or can achieve it in ways that manage the trade-offs that we otherwise have between affordability, reliability, safety, sustainability, and the rest.
Sure. So as Alan said, I'm David Spence from the University of Texas, where I am primarily in the law school, but also in the business school. And everything I do has to do with the regulation of the energy industry. And I've been doing that in one form or another for almost 40 years. Kara called me to come to this conference to represent the perspective of the state of Texas. I heard that California was the most important state this morning.
It is
We
true.
in Texas never brag about ourselves. I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about abundance. I was going to make a remark similar to what Robinson said earlier about the title. But when I think about abundance as sort of a recent movement / buzzword, I think about it as a reaction to how different people weigh the three trade-offs that Alan mentioned in the energy system between having a reliable supply, an affordable supply, and minimizing environmental impacts. And I think when you look at the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson book, or sort of I would call that the sort of left half of the abundance set of abundance advocates, they are people who are not shying away from ambition on climate, but they believe that the way that climate, particularly climate activists and parts of the climate policy world have framed those trade-offs is incomplete, and that affordability and reliability have gotten short shrift in those discussions. And so I came here ready to sort of talk about those things, but our keynote speaker and the first panel hit a lot of those ideas. When William asked John Reynolds this morning about the trade-off between affordability and climate, he immediately answered with a remark about reliability and safety and other trade-offs. And some of what he said, frankly, in online worlds that I'm a part of, would have produced a really sharp reaction when he talked about NEM 1.0. I know places, at least online places, and I don't mean crazy Twitter places, I mean places where people, really well-educated people talk about these issues. That idea of that's producing a major cost shift would produce huge blowback. And so one thing I like about a conference focused on abundance is that we're now, those trade-offs, all three parts of that stool that we used to talk about in the energy trilemma are all getting talked about in serious ways, which in my perception wasn't always the case. And in Texas, we have always talked about those things because we're always bumping into people in the oil industry or the wind industry or the solar industry, but people who work in these areas. And so I'm really happy to see that today we're gonna talk about all three parts of that set of trade-offs.
Good. Thank you, David. Ryan, I want to, before we get into the nitty-gritty, which we will in a moment, highlight the fact that a lot of the conversation we have in places like this, which is a law school, well, especially when we bump up against policy, deals a lot with trade-offs, deals a lot with interest groups, deals a lot with different ways one could filter this and the regulatory impact as it bumps up against markets. Energy consists of different kinds of markets. Some of them are highly regulated, like power. We talked earlier William, you made some comments too about how we regulate, for example, electric utilities and the generation, transmission, distribution portions of their businesses. Natural gas, largely deregulated in the United States, but also subject to different regimes. Oil less so, but yet we see governments with strategic reserves that are being released to stabilize oil prices. There's still a political and therefore policy element to it. When you as an economist are looking at how policies are made, how do you tamper down the lawyers' overly enthusiastic views of what's ideal and say, well, wait a second, there's a market response to this, and yes, there's a regulatory overlay, but how do we optimize things so that we have some chance of hitting that abundance in a way that's sustainable?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And I'm Ryan Cummings. I'm the chief of staff at CEPR, and I'm an economist. I spent 2 years in the Biden administration working on energy and financial markets, which is also my focus as a researcher. To answer your question, I was actually defending lawyers in economic policymaking yesterday on the internet because I think economists and lawyers work really well together in creating really good economic policy when both understand what their comparative advantage is. Which is an economist term, but lawyers are really good and excel at creating good processes. I would never want an economist to sit there and, for example, think about what kind of rights people should have or what should be the litigation process or something like that. And as you mentioned, economists are very good about thinking about trade-offs and framing those. So directly to your question, how do we kind of restrain people? It's trying to impose some sort of rigorous discipline and giving people frameworks for how to think about things. So in economists, we call these things corner solutions, where it's one extreme or the other. And almost always, as I'm sure everybody here knows, it's a bit more of a gradient. And so for us, we try and do a bit of number crunching. So we try and size different impacts and then evaluate those trade-offs against each other. But even more importantly than that, provide a way to think about the problem that's actually grounded in what we know about economics, that's grounded in different parameters that we have in the literature, meaning different kind of numbers that show the relationship between different events. So it's trying to just pull everybody together, understanding, okay, here's the policy we're trying to achieve. What's the process necessary to achieve that? And what's the economic analysis that you need to do to make sure that you're sizing and understanding the trade-offs correctly?
Good. With that, I want to turn to politics, David, because one of the things that people think, was it right versus left? I'm not sure that's really the right way to characterize it. Democrat, Republican in the United States context, I'm not sure that's the right way to characterize it. And if we could bring up David's slide, which is the two bar charts, I want to ask maybe if it's not a question of people of any party or any political persuasion who rely on data-driven ways of making decisions, and fundamentally, whether it's in a matter of planetary boundaries in physics or engineering or economics, are looking at cause and effect, and others who maybe have beliefs that are somewhat divorced from cause and effect. How do you see the politics around this question of the energy transition? And in particular, we can look, I know on your slides, for example, at some of the politics around priorities that should or should not be given to renewable energy compared to other types of energy.
That's a really big question. And I brought the slide to answer a smaller question, but obviously polarization in the United States is, really affecting how we try to craft solutions to these complicated political problems. It's getting in the way of bipartisanship. Polarization is many things. It's more than just the parties disagreeing on policy, being ideologically farther apart than they used to be, which they are, but it's also about them hating one another. Negative partisanship or affective partisanship, as political scientists would say. And that latter effect, which seems to be amplifying a little bit all the time, is turning Republicans who used to support growing renewable energy, some Republicans who used to support it, against it. Now, the president is part of the signal that they're receiving about how to be a good Republican, and he hates wind in particular because of a golf course in Scotland. But it shows that we're not winning in the battle to try and persuade the undecided, the moderates, the people in the middle who were once for cleaner energy in certain ways, who seem to be turning against it. These pictures on the left-hand figure only cover the period of time from 2019 to 2025. And so you can see a sharp drop, a majority opposing expanding among Republicans, expanding renewable energy. And that's discouraging. That's a problem. And so I think that narratives that treat the people that are sort of in the middle, the people we want to persuade to build a majority, as apostates or immoral or any of those things, which we sometimes see in political debate, are probably counterproductive to the overall goal of growing a climate coalition or a clean energy coalition and pushing the ball forward when it comes to the energy transition.
I want to stay on the slide for a second if we could, because if I'm looking at the left-hand portion here. This is the Americans who would give a priority to renewable energy. And two things jump off the chart to me, but tell me if I'm looking at it correctly or not. Well, three things. One is that the Democrats or lean Democrats don't seem to be changing very much. There's very high continuous support for renewables. So when I look at the total U.S. adult number, it looks like almost all of that drop-off is because of changes in Republicans or lean Republican point of view. Are the samples also, though, showing that there may be fewer people looking at those numbers, maybe more on the Republican side, but maybe from either party, who are also not identifying where they fit into either one of those two Democrat-Republican buckets? And if so, how are the independents affected?
Yeah, so as the parties become more ideologically polarized, people who don't like that leave the party. So independents as a group are growing in number. That makes the median party member even more extreme, because most of the seats in Congress are held by people who don't face a risk of losing their next election in the general election. Their only way of losing their job next time around is to lose the primary. So they are mostly beholden to those people who are still in those parties, still voting in the primaries, which tend to be, even within the party, the more ideologically extreme members and the more negatively partisan members. So I think you're seeing it right in that sense. You're also seeing it right in that almost all the movement is on the Republican side. That's a story that's sometimes overlooked in the sense that Democrats mostly agree on this stuff. Most Democrats, whether they call themselves moderates or progressives, agree on the goal. And so sometimes we get in our own way agreeing. I'm a Democrat. Did it come through? I hope. Sometimes
All we heard was Texas.
Sometimes we get in our own way when it comes to trying to, even keep our own group, focused on keeping our eyes on the prize, right?
Now, one of the things your slide to the right also indicates, and I notice it's phrased as opposing phasing out the production of gasoline vehicles. I don't know if that's meant to be a mandatory phase out or just kind of the way that, I'm not sure how that question was phrased exactly, but that one does seem to be a little bit different in its results. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Pew has been asking, these are all Pew Research pictures, I didn't create them, but Pew's been asking that as a tracking question ever since the sort of the cascade of bans on internal combustion vehicles in UK and in certain big European cities and in certain big American cities. And so people have always been most people have been all of the above people when they respond to these questions in polls. And voters are very insecure about energy. They always think prices are high, as we saw in the first panel. No matter whether they've gone down or gone up lately, they tend to say that they're too high. And they're always insecure about losing choice, right? So fears that they're going to be forced to drive an EV, and they look at the sticker price of an EV. Most people in all walks of life don't think through the life cycle cost of an investment. And so I drive an EV. It's incredibly cheap to operate, and I'm quite sure that over its life cycle, it's cheaper than a comparable internal combustion engine, at least in Texas, where electric rates are low. And so, yeah, that's fairly, we've seen a decline, especially on the Republican side there, but even on the Democratic side, as people worry about losing that choice, I think.
Yeah. Katie, I want to stay with EVs for a second, because there's also an equity argument here. So, I drove here my EV. It's a pretty nice EV. And I can plug it in at work. I can plug it in at home, and I can go to a charging station along the way, because where I'm going, they tend to have them. But if I lived in an apartment, in whether it's rural or in inner city or urban community, and I didn't have a place to park, certainly not one that had a charging station anywhere nearby, that would be a very different calculus for me. How do we bridge those social and economic justice issues while also facilitating, for example, the greening of mobility?
Yeah, and I want to carry over from David's point to say I think what we're seeing here in terms of polling is two independent and yet intersecting forces. One is the incredible wealth and marketing power of the fossil fuel industry. The amount of money that they are making, the amount of money they are spending on lobbying, on advertisements, on billboards in communities. I'm from Kern County. You can't drive a block without seeing something that says Chevron on it. I mean, our high school's mascot is the Drillers, for crying out loud. And so like there's a whole segment of just like very intentional political pushback, because in reality, while this chart may represent Democrats as a whole nationwide, it does not represent Democrats in California. We had a Democratic governor last year propose legislation that would have done CEQA streamlining for new oil wells across the state of California with no cap. That passed the legislature in California and has a Democratic supermajority. We were able to beat back the worst provisions of that bill. But I want to say it again, in California, we're opening the door to more drilling in a supermajority Democratic legislature with no evidence, no actual data, no actual science that says this is what we need to do either for our climate or for our near-term goals. So that's like one bucket of just the politics and the amount of money that's flowing in on these questions. The other bucket is the very real dynamic of equity and affordability, and the very real issue that like it is the year 2026 and we still have significant structural barriers to people accessing this new clean technology. I advocate against oil and gas for a living, and I live in an apartment and I can't have an EV. You know how much that kills me when I had to go buy a new car and be like, this is it. This is the only one I can get because it's the one that makes sense for me the most financially. And I don't want to have to deal with all of this regulatory process. We have no community charging. Even if you have access to chargers, you need all the apps and you need to know how to navigate the apps and you need a credit card and you need to know who to do. And there's all sorts of work that goes into this, that there's organizations in the Central Valley whose literal function is to help environmental justice communities figure out how to access EVs when they can finance it and access charging. So there's a very real issue with access, and there's a very real issue with affordability. I think part of what trailed off for me in the panel before this was the discussion about community benefits. And to the point we were saying, like the discussion has been really one-sided. We haven't really thought about who benefits and how they benefit. And a great example, again, in the Central Valley, they have some of the largest solar farms in the entire state and some of the highest electrical bills. My brother-in-law lives an easy stone throw, quick run away from some huge solar farms, and he's paying $500-600 a month in the summer in Bakersfield just to keep his home at the level that my autistic nephews can handle, right? And so this is a very real issue that has been significantly overlooked because we've let the market figure it out, and we've let the market decide where they want to go, who they want to approach. They've lobbied for these incentives, and we haven't been intentional enough about ensuring that those benefits actually can reach everybody.
So, Ryan, you've heard that. How much of that is cost allocation issues, and how much of it is that we have externalities, where certain costs, for example, the cost of pollution, whether on the environmental degradation, climate change, public health impacts, are not priced in to certain products, for example, fossil fuels for transportation?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask a climate economist, which to be clear, I don't consider myself a climate economist, not anything against them, I just don't study, for example, how emissions impact the economy. But if you ask them, they'd say, Trump is actually a pretty pro-climate president because he's enacted what's equivalent now to $100 a ton climate tax with this war in Iran. So in terms of externalities being priced.
Nothing reduces emissions like a recession or a depression.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at 2020 as well, is this on? Okay, yeah. If you look at 2020, additionally, emissions totally collapsed as well. And Trump is setting the stage for that yet again. So maybe this room should have a different perspective. But I think just broadly, economists know very much that these externalities are not priced. The kids that are living next to refineries, the refineries are not giving them transfers saying, here's the $400,000 lifetime impact on the kid from getting asthma next to the refinery. That's a transfer that's not taking place. With carbon, for example, extreme weather events, we know that's a transfer that's not taking place. So that's why you have to, economists, if you ask kind of the median climate economists, there's this fancy concept, which most people in this room are probably familiar with, the social cost of carbon, meaning how much do you have to value pollution. People will say something to the effect of it's anywhere between, in the Biden administration, the number was around $150. There was a new paper that came out somewhat recently that said it was $1,000 a ton, which if you took that literally, that would mean pretty much shutting down every single fossil fuel plant in the country immediately. So the externalities are very large, but then there's the equity issues that we talk about. So if, for example, in California, the industry is pushing this very aggressively right now, we have a cap and trade debate going on, or with a carbon tax, the people who are most likely going to feel a lot of that first are the lowest income people, because that's going to show up in higher gasoline prices. It's going to show up in those higher fossil fuel prices. So the question really is, can the government effectively reallocate that tax, for example, that they're getting from people at the pump or from the refiners and give it to the people who are most effective, most affected, rather.
Yeah. You want to?
Sure, yeah, I do. Because we just did the renewal of CAPA and Invest as it's been rebranded last year. And this is where I think another fundamental shift in California's policy perspective has happened in recent years, is that we've really gone back to this age-old like Reaganomics, trickle-down economics theory of change, which is if I give the industry more handouts, then they will lower prices. Which is, there is no evidence of that happening, right? Like we've done that, in Kern County, they do that with oil extraction for sure. It doesn't actually result in savings for consumers. It results in more pocketed money and profits for the producers and more control on their part and how they set prices and how much profit they gain. So like to the point that Ryan said, like this important policy distinctions on like how much do we just give them to help them comply? How much do we charge them to comply? Because I know that if I charge them that $30 a ton, that money I can put straight back into the climate credit. I can put that straight back into EV infrastructure through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That is managed money that the state controls versus giving them that $30 a ton and hoping that maybe they reduce gas prices. It's been an incredibly frustrating time for us as policy advocates in the Capitol, because we kind of keep banging our head against this one wall, which is the oil industry saying, well, if you regulate us, we're going to increase prices, and us saying they're going to increase prices anyways. So it's really an important notion that it's not that simple, and that the state really does have a role, in our opinion, in regulating these industries so that they can ensure that benefit passes through rather than trusting the industries to do the right thing.
Thank you, Kitty. David?
Yeah, I'm going to fulfill my role and say a Texan thing that pushes back a little bit again. I don't know who represents Kern County. Is it a Democrat or a Republican?
It's a Democrat.
I think in a lot of the Central Valley, it's Republicans, is it not?
It's pretty split, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's better. It's better for Republicans than the coast. Yeah. What I'm getting at is that I don't think that when people vote Republican, especially if they sympathize with Republicans on energy issues, they're necessarily duped by fossil fuel company propaganda. There's a lot of work in political science that looks at the alienation of rural voters from the Democratic Party. The evolution of the perception that Democrats are urban elites who don't care about them and who just want to tell them how to live their lives. And climate policy has been part of that. They feel alienated by talk of abandoning gas-powered cars, or not eating meat, or not having children as a climate measure. And maybe a lot of people in this room haven't heard those prescriptions advocated, but there's a lot of places where you do hear them advocated, and every time it's advocated, even if it's by a small sliver of people, it ends up on Fox News, right? And that Fox News tells people that's what a Democrat is, right? And so I think when I said let's keep our eyes on the prize, I think the prize is lowering atmospheric carbon and lowering emissions to lower atmospheric carbon. It's not vanquishing the oil and gas industry, at least in my view. If you live in Texas and you talk to people who are on the Democratic left and favor the energy transition, very, very few of them think that closing down the oil and gas industry completely anytime in the next 10 years is a good idea.
So before I get to Ryan on shutting down oil and gas industry, David, I want to stay with you for a second, because some of this, we're in a university. One of the premises of the university is that expertise matters, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of the business model, if I may, for a public university and a private university as well. Because if expertise doesn't matter, it's kind of a question of what are we all doing here? So I'm going to submit, I agree. I think expertise does matter. But when you look at voters or people who choose not to vote but still have, a choice to make in the marketplace, or on social media or other things to do sway opinion. Maybe it's not just the quality of the information that people have, but whether they trust whatever the talking head is who has or claims to have expertise from whatever side. And I would include, experts who are, oil and gas executives in this, as well as, people like me who might, teach a course in a law school that relates to climate and finance. How do we rebuild that trust if the quality of the information is uneven, and there's not a consensus anymore, perhaps in some quarters, about who's to be trusted, let alone what they're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take this opportunity to plug my book. From a couple of years, 18 months ago, I wrote a book called Climate of Contempt about climate and energy politics. And one chapter is devoted to the role of the rise of ideological and social media as a disseminator of propaganda and bad information. And it's really eroded trust. And the empirical work shows that it's eroded trust and expertise everywhere, including universities, but everywhere. And that's a huge, huge problem. When you couple it with sort of tribal loyalty to a party, people really shut their minds off from good information. And rebuilding that, it happened over a long period of time, over a couple of decades, 3 decades, and it's going to be just as slow a process to repair it, I think, which will involve getting back to talking to each other across partisan and ideological boundaries, which is something we stopped doing, and essentially breaking the spell of propaganda like you would deprogram somebody from a cult, right? And I'm not just talking about the Fox News. I think this is it's not a symmetrical problem, but it happens on both sides, according to the research. And so I think it's a hard question, and I think my book prescribes an answer, but it's a frustrating one for a lot of people because it's slow. And that, I don't have much more to say than that.
Okay. Katie, you had a thought.
I did. I had a few thoughts, so I'm going to try to keep myself organized. I think the dynamics are very local. And so in a place like Kern County, for instance, where such a significant portion of the workforce is connected to oil and gas in some way, what we see is, I remember our CalGEM, formerly, DOGGR, was the acronym that regulates oil and gas, at a hearing in Kern County. And there were 300 people lined up before it started that were all there, all oil and gas workers, all to say, don't take my job. And so I think there's a real balance here of just saturation that happens in some markets. I have a friend in Sacramento, she's a researcher, for crying out loud. And she's like, well, isn't the price higher because California has such stronger regulations? And I was like, yes. And you're not getting the whole story. And by the time we finished talking, she's like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how often I was seeing that at the gas station at different places. It really permeated. I didn't even think to ask twice. And so there's a level of just saturation and investment that has to happen in getting the news out around what the data actually says. And then there is that part of lack of trust in institutions, to what David just said. We have not demonstrated to the workers in Kern County that we are capable of providing a meaningful path forward to them that will ensure they can stay home with their families and provide for their needs. We have not shown them that. We have not shown non-oil workers that we can do this transition in a way that's not just going to increase their energy bills and leave them figuring it out. So there is a real lack of work. The conversations need to happen, but the work needs to happen. We can't keep expecting these things to figure themselves out just because a bunch of folks in San Jose bought solar panels first, right? Eventually we need to get into the muck here and figure out what this transition will look like in a way, and show them what it will look like in a way that gives them confidence that when I tell them, hey, when we talk about just transition, and to be frank, even though I clapped when you said the oil and gas industry would go away, we don't support, my clients don't support it going away tomorrow because it would devastate the economy in Kern, and there is no plan for Kern County. But we do support it going away. It's just, it needs to be done really thoughtfully so we can build trust that we mean it when we say that we're not going to leave anybody behind. And if one more person tells me that offshore wind in Humboldt is the just transition strategy for Kern County oil workers, I'm going to scream, because it's not real and it's not realistic. That's 12 hours away from them. And I think there's really got to have that investment, what they've been doing with the Hydro Training Partnership Program, what other work has been happening to invest in community organizations to start those conversations. There is a people's plan in Kern County. There are are people's plans and different work happening across the state as to what it could look like, things the neighborhoods and the residents are excited about, that if we start investing in those, we can show them that we actually mean what we say and we're committed to the outcome.
I want to stay, and Brian, I'm going to turn to you in a second. I want to stay on gasoline in particular, but looking at the role that other events around the world play and kind of that public perception, and may just put some data points around it. If we look at California, and we look at the price at the pump, and people from Texas might look at the price at the pump. You might today, in fact, if you go around and say, well, that's more than we pay in Texas.
Always.
There's a misunderstanding sometimes as to why that is. I mean, if you go into a Chevron gas station, you'll see a sign that tells you it's taxes. But that's not really, that's the same 75% margin we've had forever. The market dynamics are such that we used to refine in California oil from California by and large. Since the mid 80s, the amount of production in California, Meta Wells is not that different, but the amount of production as the geologic depletion happens over time has gone down 75%. So how do you plug that gap with more people driving more miles? Well, one way is fuel efficiency standards. So we have a more efficient fleet. Even without EVs, we were making progress there. We import a lot of oil, and the kind of oil that works for our refineries often comes from overseas, in particular from Saudi Arabia and other places that now are impacted by global wars in a way that perhaps the Texas and the Gulf Coast is not. And you lay on top of that, what about trucks? Diesel. Well, the majority of our diesel fuel now is from either biofuels or mostly renewable diesel, which is also lower, for emissions, but it also can be more expensive. And now we're looking at the price of soybeans and how that's impacted by, droughts in Latin America, and that's directly translated to what we're paying for diesel fuel here. So all those things, when you put them together, Ryan, and we can pull up Ryan's slides if you have them, tell us a bit about refinery closures, because there isn't enough need for them perhaps in some areas, but what the refinery margin does to gasoline prices here and some of the choices and trade-offs we have around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Brendan, if I get the microphone, or I'll just talk. So I'll just go up because I'm going to walk through some slides. Luckily, I have a very loud voice. So the question. So whenever we're talking about what actually increases prices for consumers, to get back to the original question from Alan.
Oh, there you go.
Sorry, loud voice plus microphone.
That was a Stanford moment.
We're all awake now.
What's actually increasing prices for consumers? What economists bring to the table is showing, okay, this is a policy choice that we're making, and we should evaluate the trade-offs, and this isn't actually increasing prices. So I just want to go through a quick economic example for the crowd. I know the room is filled with lawyers, so there's no equations. I know there'd be riots, there'd be deaths, and the lawyers might be sued. So it's just a quick graph. So here's how to think about it. So whenever you're looking at gasoline prices, we say the marginal barrel sets the price at any particular moment. So this is, the marginal barrel means the most expensive barrel to bring to market. And I'm just going to give you an example. So just imagine California has 3 refiners. In reality, we really have 5. But just imagine there's 3 refiners. Each of them produce 200,000 barrels a day. The state typically consumes around 800,000 barrels a day. So they make up 3/4 of state demand. And so these refiners have different costs of production. And what that means is they can't all sell at the same price profitably. So some of them are going to be able to sell for lower prices than others. And so once the demand exceeds the max in-state capacity, as Alan was just kind of describing, this happened over time, you have to go to the global market to fulfill this. So you hop up to what economists would call a different cost curve. The important point I want to fix in everybody's mind here is that once demand is greater than capacity, the price is going to be set by the imported barrel, regardless of how many refineries remain open. So an additional refinery closing, just for prices, narrowly here in the long run, okay, there's different pockets of why that matters, but an additional refinery closing for prices does not matter in the long run. Here's why. So here I have a graph, and on the top axis is the price, on the bottom axis is the quantity. This is in barrels a day, dollars a gallon. So imagine initially we have this situation. Demand is pretty low, and there's only one refiner that can produce at this relatively low price. So let's call that $2 a gallon. So this refiner demands exactly at their max capacity. So now we have prices of $2 a gallon. We're consuming 200,000 gallons a day of gasoline. And let's say demand increases further. So now it's at the max capacity of the next refiner. So this next refiner, they can produce at 250 or above, so they come online. So So now we have 400,000 barrels a day of gasoline consumed at a price of $2.50. Same situation, we have more demand, now it's at 600,000 barrels a day, and the price goes up to $3 a gallon. Okay? Everybody following? Are we good? We have our little stars for the equilibrium? Okay. So what happens now whenever our demand goes up to 800,000, which is roughly where we're at, 750, demand goes up to 800,000. Well, we have to go to the global market. Okay? And what's important is these cost curves, the horizontal lines, for the global market, we consider it flat, meaning it's really competitive market, so people are going to undercut each other, so it doesn't really matter how much more demand you have, it's going to be the same price relatively. Okay, so that's how the price is set whenever you're a net importer in the marine sense of gasoline, which California is. So now here's the question. What happens when refiner 3 shuts down? So let's say demand has been declining as it has in the States since 2006. We've seen a 20% decrease in the demand of gasoline. Well, we have our picture from this before. So what happens when refiner 3 gets eliminated? Well, we still have demand that's at 800,000 barrels a day. We just go to the global market sooner. Nothing about this picture changes. The price does not increase. So the way the industry has been kind of representing this is if a refinery closes, we're going to have an immediate 15, 20% reduction in supply. It's going to be a Mad Max world. Necromancers are going to rise from the ground, hug your family, peace with God. But in reality, for prices, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Now, there's some important caveats here. This is a long-run analysis, so not in the short run. So whenever you see a refinery go down, in reality, the refiners do have to go to the global market and convince another refiner somewhere else to kind of change to make a California blend stock or California gasoline. So there are price increases in the short run with a refinery explosion, as they love to do. The international cost curve, this slopes upward in the short run, what I was just saying. This is all conditional on ensuring sufficient import capacity. So what you're seeing right now in Northern California in particular with Valero Benicia closing is that it's not clear whether that's going to be turned into what's called a product terminal, meaning you can go in there, you can drop off imported gasoline, or it's just going to be shut down, or somebody else is going to buy it. But if you don't have that import capacity to bring it in, then it is a real reduction in supply. And then you do see prices go very, very high. So without the production, you do see increasingly higher prices. So that is a little more dire. There's also 3 buckets to this problem, the way I think about it. You have prices for consumers, and then you have refinery workers, and then you have the communities that Katie works with very closely. So this is just talking about prices. I'm not saying refinery closures don't matter for the workers in the communities, they definitely do. But in my view, the solution to that is very easy. It's just we should buy them out. So whenever a refinery closes, in my opinion, I think the economically efficient transfer to do is to just tell the refinery workers in the communities, listen, we're going to cover the rest of your contract of how much you would have probably worked. Maybe the refiner covers their pension or something like this, and similarly with the communities. And especially if you look at the amounts involved, whenever Valero Benicia was closing, they were pushing for a $300 million subsidy. Okay, that's a very large subsidy. So in my opinion, a much better use of that would be to acknowledge that these workers have given their health. A lot of them have much higher exposure to cancer, they have much higher asthmatic exposure. Same thing with the communities. To acknowledge the service they've done in creating stable, reliable energy for the state over all these years, and give the communities grants, for example, in the case of Benicia, they said it was around $10 million a year in terms of their tax base. Just give them a bridge for 10 years of $10 million each to be able to replace that, and similarly with the workers, just kind of buy them out. I think that's a more efficient thing. But the things that are not adding to prices, so for example, cap and invest, or low carbon fuel standard, or the state excise tax, that may in fact raise prices at the pump for consumers. Okay, but there's a trade-off with that. There's cleaner air, there's a lot of local environmental benefits to that. Okay, so the prices may rise, but there's a trade-off with that. But whenever we have refineries closing, it's not like we have this huge reduction in supply. Yeah, so that's it.
Well done.
All right, so I want to lay another sector on top of this then, and that's transportation. And it's because of what you just said and because of, Katie, what you were saying about Oildale, that kind of brought this to mind. California high-speed rail. We haven't talked about transit. You know, we talk about transportation and electrification, mobility and things. We've got to look at transit. And you can't look at any of these things, energy or transportation, what have you, without looking at land use. Sometimes people say, why is it that the California high-speed rail line is mapped to go through the Central Valley when that's not the shortest distance between LA and San Francisco? You're not going to displace airline traffic between those. You know, people are going to fly Burbank, Oakland, you know, as much as they can. They're not going to jump on the train probably for 3 hours. Some will. but some won't. Why do that? And the answer was, to your political question, when this was being proposed initially, is, well, now we can get Democrats and Republicans, we can get politicians from all over the state to support this. But there's another one, and it kind of mimics what happened with high-speed rail in Japan, and it's an economic one. When we built out the highway network and displaced our older mass transit, including rail lines in Southern California, and had the urban sprawl into the valley and into Temecula and Orange County and San Diego County and so forth, and brought in all of those people on highways to work in LA, we broadened that net of where employers could get potential labor, which had very beneficial impacts on economic growth in the region. This is sort of a way of doing the same thing. You don't have to build housing near the coast where wealthy environmentalists can stop development if you can have more sprawl in Fresno and Bakersfield and Stockton and Visalia, which is, by the way, why some of them are not as red as they used to be politically, because there's more people there who moved from Southern California or from the Bay Area. And to commute 3 hours to their jobs, well, if you can put them on a train and they can commute for an hour and a half or an hour, now suddenly you've widened that pool. And economic studies of the impact of high-speed trains in Japan kind of bear that out. You get a lot of economic productivity, and you basically have exported sprawl to areas that were previously rural. What does that mean for climate? What does that mean for economic allocation? And what does that mean for the intersectionality between, say, energy and transportation? Any of the above, to any of you.
I would just say on the economics, there's something that we call agglomeration in economics. So typically economists like to think about if the inputs into production can freely flow to their highest and best use, that's the optimal thing. And so whenever we think about these constraints, it's so core to the abundance argument, which I think is very true, of not being able to live close to your work or not having good transit options. That's going to really weigh on economic growth. And there is a paper by Enrico Moretti and Jose that shows the impacts of this are very large. Now, the exact results of this paper have been disputed, but everybody agrees directionally it's weighed on GDP substantially. The fact that you can't have people moving where their labor's highest and best use because you have all of these regulations that prevent people from doing that. So having a better transportation network, for example, a high-speed rail, or maybe you have better commuter trains, or in Los Angeles, is there public transit in the city? I haven't noticed any.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Oh, okay, all right. Sorry, LA Metro fans. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Measure M and Measure R, and by the way, those are sales tax measures that also cover operating costs, unlike in BART.
Okay, yeah.
Whereas
Well,
BART doesn't have financial.
I should maybe retract, because up in the Bay, we may not have public transit in a few months here, but
You need to you need to measure. Yeah.
but yeah, I think just having that transit, really, you do see those quote unquote agglomeration benefits, and they're very large.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about high-speed rail in the Valley. And to your point, I will say, Ellen, like, yes, there are a significant number of people in the Valley who are already commuting pretty significant distances to get to job opportunities. We would rather see those job opportunities in the Valley. But, it would be nice to have an alternative. However, my uncle was the head of planning for the city of Bakersfield at the end of his career. And you want to know what the proudest accomplishment of his career was when he retired, was that they had done more annexations than they had ever done before under his leadership, which means they had done more to expand the urban growth boundary and the city boundary out into green and ag spaces. And he's like, isn't this great? And I was a little first-year grad student like, like, no, it's not great, but I wasn't going to debate this at the holiday dinner table. But, most planners learn planning is a very political thing, just like anything else. Most planners learn their craft on the job. You have planning schools, but they're learning the nuances of zoning and rezoning and applications on the job. Central Valley does not know how to plan densely. The Central Valley, there's simply not the capacity. I remember when high-speed rail was first starting when I was an undergrad, when the ballot measure was going forward, and I said, it would make more sense if you put that stop in Delano instead of Bakersfield, and then really invested and put policies in place to get Delano to grow more sustainably, because Bakersfield Bakersfield ain't going to do that. Bakersfield's just going to keep going. And so I think it really comes down to like, what is the function of the Valley? What Valley residents want is an economy that isn't dependent on oil, gas, and big ag. And what they want are jobs in our communities. They'd like to see EV manufacturing. They'd like to talk about solar panel recycling. They'd like to do a whole host of things around agriculture. Because remember, one big thing that we think about, to Ryan's point about holistic thinking, is like we are enveloping so much fertile farmland and we're not investing in the types of strategies we're going to need long term to ensure we have a stable food supply. And we're displacing all of those workers who are never going to drive to the Bay for a job in tech because that's simply not in their skill set and they need that work to continue. So it's I have a lot to say. The Central Valley groups at this point are relatively agnostic on high-speed rail because we've put billions and billions and billions of dollars into this project and have not reduced 1 ton of carbon emissions because there's no trains running on it yet, right? So we're very much in the mindset of like, was this the best idea? Because it's been a decade and we still aren't seeing any actual benefits. But I will say from the Central Valley perspective, I would not be doing my job if I didn't say that the Valley wants to be more than just a bedroom community. The Valley wants, when you think about a local tax base, when you think about what it takes to have thriving cities and counties, it takes a lot more than just having people live there. And that's the sort of work that, again, when we talk about making the promise real for communities, Kern County opposes oil and gas because they have no reason to expect that they'll have anything to replace it when it goes away. And so that's the type of angle that we'd like to see more investment and discussion in.
I just want to add that it seems like the subtext of this panel and all the panels is really historic economic inequality and the power of rich people to keep unwanted land uses out of their neighborhoods. And, there's always reasons offered. It's too dense or it's too hilly or whatever. But whether it's transportation or energy infrastructure or whatever, until we solve sort of, the massive and growing economic inequality, we're always going to see those better off communities find ways to leverage law and political power to sort of push things into other places, push costs into other places. And it'd be nice if we talked about that more openly. It's another trade-off, I guess. That if we talked about it more openly as a sort of fundamental behind all these discussions, I think that would be a good idea. And I see Katie chomping at
I can't help it. Sorry. If you know me, you
please.
know that I can't help it. And my friend Jen is over there twitching in her seat from CBE. But I will say, yes. And then also, what the state has done, and I don't want to take the thunder away from the next panel, is say, okay, across the state, we're just going to waive CEQA. Well, that's not been the problem in Bakersfield. The problem in Bakersfield is that we can't get them to say no to a project, frankly. The problem in Bakersfield is that they're just like, so to David's point, it really does come down to power and it comes down to a more nuanced analysis of what the issue is. The issue is not necessarily CEQA. The issue is economic advantage and power and whether or not communities have the ability to tell their local jurisdiction, we don't want that warehouse in this community when they don't have the political power to get them to say no versus a community in a more affluent part of the state. So we do a lot of this blunt policy making from the state level in response to a trend that's really mostly in the Bay. And a little, I remember talking to Assemblymember Wicks' staff, and she's been leading this like assembly working group on like deregulating things. And I'm like, you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist in the Central Valley. They'll build anything in the Central Valley. You want to come? You want to put a sewage plant next to a neighborhood? Sure. It's like we don't say no. We will find a way to make it happen. And so it's how do we have that really nuance? So the point around power is so critical. It's like what we're talking about are communities that don't have elected representatives that they've been able to get into office that don't have the ability to push back on these projects. They're the ones that are carrying the brunt now of all of this energy development, all this warehouse development, all this infrastructure development, and the communities that can push back are not. And that is a real question that deserves a lot more nuanced policy intervention than we've seen in California.
But the
David,
reason
go ahead.
abundance is tied to affordability is because you got to build stuff to bring prices down. It's supply and demand, right? Now, I hope your warehouse example is different from what the next panel's talking about because in housing, at least in Austin, we have built a ton of new rental housing and rents have come down. We used to be above the national average. We're below the national average. If you look at the tables of who builds the most housing per capita, we're up near the top. If you look at the tables of who builds the least, we're in one of those cities right now, and San Francisco too. So, I think if you want to help people that are the sort of rental strata of income, you got to build more stuff.
Yeah, but you
Love it.
also have to keep in mind, sorry, I can't.
I don't mean to.
I know,
Go ahead,
but
Heather.
you have to
Yeah.
keep in mind the idea that these are also companies that want profit. And so like without regulations in place to ensure, for instance, that there's a vacancy tax if you keep a bunch of vacant apartment units at $3,000 a month, right? You need those controls. And again, that's what I mean with California. We've swung so far to the other side of just like, we want to lower costs. Reaganomics is our thing now. Let's just make it cheaper for people to do things without the complementary policies that will actually ensure that that housing that gets built, those products that are sold, all of that work is actually cheaper. And so what we're seeing is like in some communities, like where I represent in Sacramento as a city council member, we had plenty of housing for everybody on the street. We had plenty of vacant units for everybody on the street. They just were listed at prices that they couldn't afford. And I didn't have the political capital to get a vacancy tax across the finish line. So there are these like tensions of just like economics and like, yes, supply demand, absolutely, intermixed with like people, you know, in the oil and gas industry, which is the subject of this panel, right? Like these are a few multinational billion-dollar, trillion-dollar companies. Like if you don't think that they talk, if you don't think that they're thinking, like, you know what, we have an article right now from the CEC who's investigating price gouging right here in LA because they're like, wait a minute, those prices at those gas stations are actually disproportionately higher than the amount of the marginal barrel increase that we're seeing internationally. That's not right. And so they're investigating them. Those types of price controls have to exist as well.
So let me just jump in for a second, just moderator privilege for a second.
We could talk about
Because as much as I'm dying to go down the rabbit holes of land use, housing, and transportation, and we could do it all day, and after break, if anybody wants to talk about it, I'm game. To any of us. But I want to pull it back for a second because we're talking about absolute price. We're also talking about relative price in an age when other prices are going up, when eggs cost more and cars cost more and other things, everybody has an affordability issue at some point, and base energy is going to come into that mix, whether it's gasoline or power or what have you. If you look at the reason we regulate and the reason we aggregate, you think of like in the power side, a utility is doing two things. It's aggregating consumers, so they have some buying power, and it's also smoothing out the volatility. And I want to come to volatility. Maybe Ryan, turn to you for a second, because one of the things that's tricky for people is managing prices when they go up and down, up and down, up and down. And the reason gasoline is so politically salient is two things. One, it moves up and down all the time, like even maybe twice a day. And there's somebody out there, well, it used to be somebody with a big long stick, now it's digital, but you can see the price outside. If you go to Ralph's or Vaughn's, you don't see the price of milk that's changing or the eggs changing on a sign in front every day. So that transparency of price volatility really hits people a lot. As opposed to, your power bill, which may go up, but it's going to go up gradually and it's going to be spread out over a lot of people, but most importantly, spread over a lot of time. So that volatility hedge is important. And one of the big shifts in power, for example, going to renewables plus storage as opposed to fossil fuels, is we end up, as the prior panel talked about, by shifting variable operating costs and therefore variable prices into capital costs, which can then be smoothed out over a long period of time using financing techniques. We've masked that, but there's a real benefit to consumers and to society from minimizing that volatility. How does that play out either economically, Ryan, or politically or legally for Dave and Katie?
Yeah, so just on the economics, it's a great point on gasoline. That's really, I think, what people don't like even more than the high prices. So $6 a gallon, which is roughly the state average right now, is a very high price. But I think if you told most Californians it's going to stay at $6 a gallon for the next 10 years, people would say that's a high price, but it's better than going down to $4 and then up to $7 and then back down to $6. When I was in the Biden administration, one thing we actually tried to push through in the Council of Economic Advisors was a floating gasoline tax for this exact reason. So that's one of the first things in the playbook you pull out whenever gas prices go high is the suspension of the federal gas tax, or in the state of California, you've seen two different Democratic candidates actually propose suspending this. Now, in my opinion, that's a horrible idea. One, because that funds our roads and the Highway Trust Fund is already lacking funds with the adoption of EVs and better fuel efficiency. Two, it's really difficult to put back on once you take it off. So instead, you could have a system in which gasoline taxes are high whenever gas prices are low, and they're low whenever gas prices are high to smooth some of that volatility. What you were saying too with the electricity bills, this is something firms already do. So the term, obviously, as many people in here know, is bill shock. They try to avoid that. They, for example, in the Northeast, where there's a much higher usage of natural gas, they hedge their natural gas prices. There's a variety of policies we could do. but almost all of them involve the politicians and policymakers taking a little pain up front. So for example, with the gas price tax, you would ideally want to enact that whenever, now you could do it whenever gas prices are high, but at some point in the future, you'd have to raise gas prices whenever gas prices fall. And so I think a little bit of courage is needed in that sense. And that's what makes this issue so difficult for a lot of policymakers is there's not that time consistency. They really don't want to have to do that tough thing in the future, but it would set up their successors and consumers more broadly much better if they were able to manage that volatility.
So David, do you see profiles in courage coming?
No, certainly not among elected politicians. Regulators who are not elected have, a little bit more leeway, although that's changing too. The way that this administration is insisting on sort of loyalty to the president and loyalty to the president's agenda as a condition of serving in formerly apolitical positions makes that, less and less likely all the time. When it comes to price volatility, this was the previous panel's discussion, but since I trampled all over the next panel, maybe I'll trample over that one. Yeah, we had that a little bit in Texas for a while. We had retail electricity prices that varied with the wholesale price until Winter Storm Uri left some individuals who didn't get off those tariffs with a $9,000 or in one case, $17,000 monthly electric bill. So, customers hate volatility as much as they hate high prices, and smoothing that out is really, really important. I will say that at the wholesale level, now that you have variability in production, more variability on the production side than you used to, along with variability on the demand side, you're going to get more price volatility in that case, unless you come up with some of the interesting ideas that the first panel was talking about to try and smooth that out. On the gasoline side, I'm not really qualified to say. We have a transportation expert here in the front row who can address this, Ann Carlson, whose book you should all go out and buy, brand new.
Yep, brand new.
What's it called? Smog and Sunshine,
And
all
the
about
book talk
LA
is
and the
coming
Clean
up
Air
right
Act.
here.
Wonderful book. Yeah.
Next Friday, be here for her book talk.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, sorry. That's all. I don't really have much more to add that's of value.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to try to compete on legal and economic terms with these two men because they can do that far better than I can. I will say, politically speaking, this just continues to make the case for why the investment in renewable energy is so important and why it's so critical that we use the resources we have available to stay committed to the just transition off fossil fuels to really keep doing the work that's been started. We are always going to be subject. The next president could do something else crazy. So it's how do we protect ourselves from price volatility as we invest in domestic energy production, domestic renewable energy production, and really building the types of systems that are not as susceptible to these international political things. And hopefully maybe we'll get in a few less wars over it. I don't know. I can dream.
Next president? Are we gonna
I'm not, no, we're not going to talk about that.
We're invading.
If we still have a democracy, we'll see.
We're invading Costa Rica for their hydro next.
I know. But it is like a thing, to your point around imports, I was spending last week with a man named Nadino from Ecuador, who's part of the tribal leadership in the Ecuadorian Amazon communities. And 50% of the crude that's coming out of the Amazon is coming to California refineries because our demand is just still so high. And so I think we have to really, and I don't mean to totally go away from the question that Alan asked, but to reframe this in context of what does climate action look like? What does it look like for us to protect our own interests? Amazon depletion means rainfall here in LA, right? Amazon depletion means more wildfires here in Southern California. So how do we start to reframe this conversation around dollars at the pump and more towards what, was talked about earlier and the totality of costs that we will see down the line if we don't continue to move in the direction we need to move in?
So I'm going to take questions from the audience in a moment. I already have some that have come in through the QR code. If you scan that's on the brochure, you can do that. We'll also be taking hands in a second with the mic going around. One of the benefits of aging is that you start to get a longer memory. Guilty. Because, I'm mindful, for example, on the transit question and look at the difference. And actually, I think, David, is an optimistic one in how LA approached, and both the state, local, and federal governments, working together, approached the build out of our subway originally in the 1980s, and the way the routes were changed because of lot of things, but let's say local politics, and our congressional delegation had a lot of a role in that, compared to the vote that we just had a few days ago in the LA Metro Board on the Line K extension. Because, Ryan, we have lots of rail stations opening and lots of bus lines opening and
Okay.
sort of things,
I'll believe it when I see it.
including to the airport, which will not have a people mover in my lifetime, but otherwise be fine. We look at the difference in how the political consensus has worked, notwithstanding some of the dysfunctions, nationally. But if you look at the geopolitics of this, I'm mindful that when we had supply disruptions and political events and even a couple of wars, although not like the current one, in the 1970s, we had an impetus to shift from oil, both for getting fuel standards, of course, and more efficient cars, but also not using oil to produce power. And Jimmy Carter said, gee, let's have renewable energy. Let's have cogeneration and industrial efficiency, including in Oildale, one of the very first cogeneration plants ever, although they used a steam for enhanced oil recovery. And we had a push for coal, which actually Carter was a big supporter of at the time. And the results of that was demand destruction for oil that did pave the way for those new technologies, renewables, wind first and then solar at scale, to drive down the costs so that they became really inexpensive. So you have zero marginal cost, you have lower capital costs, you have less volatility, less supply chain disruptions, and all the rest. This time around, we're starting to see in the short term coal spiking, China, Southeast Asia, things I mentioned before, probably less so in the US because of our domestic gas supplies and renewables that we have. But globally, that's an issue. But maybe demand destruction even for LNG, but also certainly globally for oil, because of the loss of supply and production facilities in the Gulf region, which would be very hard and expensive and time-consuming to replace. That could mean that renewables become a better option for a lot of places in the world. Is that too optimistic, or is that right?
Just a note that's tricky, though, about the transition. So that graph that I showed you with the marginal costs going up, and that's where demand intersects. That's what makes the transition to renewables so tricky, because we do know they have a zero marginal cost and their levelized cost of energy is much lower and all of these great benefits. And whenever I was in the Biden administration, we obviously passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're really excited about that. And everybody said, great, we can show more renewables equals lower electricity prices, to which I would have to unfortunately say, no, mon chéri, that's actually not the case, because it's set by the marginal unit in power as well, which is fossil fuels. And so it's the coal. So it's even though,
if I may, that's so, if you look at, I'm going to get wonky for a second, nodal pricing, and you look at locational differences, you can go 5 miles and the cost of power, not the price necessarily, but the cost of power is significantly different.
For sure, yeah. And on the wholesale basis, obviously, it depends on the time of day and all sorts of things like this. But if you're just looking at average rates, for example, the correlation between renewables penetration and prices is going to be lower than you might. It's definitely positive, but it's still going to be lower than you think. So it's difficult. That's why you really have to push trying to make sure that you have the improved battery storage and that your base load is, for example, nuclear or battery or something like this, because even as you wean yourself off, the pricing dynamics, the way the price is set, is until you can say you're 100, and this is where the nodal pricing comes in, obviously, but until you're 100% renewable, you're going to have difficulty actually reflecting kind of those benefits, because some of them might be just transfers to some of the
You
utilities.
mean in moments that you're 100%?
Exactly,
So
exactly.
there are places where renewables are sometimes the marginal.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when it's very cheap, right?
Yeah,
And we have
yeah,
that. But if you're just looking over, for example, a month or something like this, or peak demand, it's very rarely, it's getting increasingly like
here
that in
in
California.
California,
Yeah.
If anybody is interested and you want to, don't do it now, but at the break, go to the App Store and download ISO today and look at CalISO's, this is the California grid. You can look at where our where our electricity is coming from by source. You can look at renewables. You can look at what share of that is storage. ERCOT in Texas also has a slick app that lets you do the same thing for their grid. And it is interesting because the short term is different than the long term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. And the need to provide for peak power or things in different times of the year, not just of the day.
Yeah.
Obviously plays a big role in this. But
We left 2 minutes for questions from the audience.
we did. I'm going with that one, but I was going to take an extra 2 minutes of our break. I had a question here, but I want to see if there's anybody in the room with their hand up who wants to ask one live. We'll get the mic to you. If not, I'll go to these. No questions for our panel. That can't be true. Here and then in the back, we have two.
Sure. Tom McHenry from Claremont and Pomona Colleges, and have some students in the back of the room. Raise your hand, students from Claremont.
Claremont.
College. There we are. The whole topic of this subject is the abundance agenda, and you've sort of talked all the way around it. And one criticism of it is that it's a prescription, it's a diagnosis without a prescription. True or false? Because it's now become sort of a meme, the abundance agenda, right? But I'm not sure, it may be one of those things that means something different to everyone. For each of the panelists, is the abundance agenda a useful way of thinking about these issues? And if so, why? Or if so, why not? Dump it, we need a new term.
Okay, while they think about it, a quick answer, I'm going to suggest that it's also a dangerous way to think about it, perhaps. If you look at planetary boundaries, the only solution to maintaining a standard of living, and here I'm looking at globally on an average, when you have rising standards of living everywhere and the air conditioning bill that goes with that, is extraordinary efficiency in building materials, efficiency in other sectors, not just energy and certainly not just power. There are economic signals that could lead to that result. There are regulatory regimes. There's international agreements that could lead to those results. Not clear to me we're on that path. And in that case, you actually have a trade-off, and nothing. I made a kind of a humorous but dark comment earlier about how recessions can reduce emissions. Extinction does the same thing. But I'm not sure that's the recipe we want. The trouble with gallows humor is it doesn't end well.
So abundance equals extinction. I wonder if the other panelists.
So I tried to give it the most charitable definition I could by saying that I hope it's about being more transparent about discussing trade-offs. But the two words that are highlighted in the title both have a million different meanings to almost everyone.
I think it's helpful in terms of thinking about certain problems. So housing and, the energy infrastructure in particular, of were the laws that were written, for example, like NEPA, still suited to purpose. I think that's useful. I think people over torque also on abundance. So for example, one thing we're working on at CEPR's childcare, and there's a lot of abundance, but childcare, you just got to kind of throw money at the problem. That's the reality of the matter. You can't like dereg your way into affordable childcare. So it depends on what the problem is, I think.
Yeah. I will just say briefly that I think it's an oversimplified analysis. And, the example that I gave of housing prices, for instance, like in Sacramento, what we found was that these units that were being kept vacant, which would not make sense, right? From an economic point of view, you can't find a renter, eventually you decline the rent so that someone will rent the unit, is because the commercial lenders were demanding a rate of return that required them to keep it. And it made sense from a tax perspective to write off that loss of income more than it did to lower the rent and potentially have an issue with your lender. And so there's so much more complication in how markets work, and it really comes down to people and greed and power. And so I think the more we can acknowledge that and work to confront those root issues, the better we will all be.
Okay, last quick question in the back.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Professor Raul Hinojosa, Chair of Chicano Studies here at UCLA. Many of my students here as well. We did a book called The Trump Paradox, which shows that the more a community is exposed to immigrants and trade, the least likely they're going to support anti-immigrant policies and anti-trade policies, and vice versa. The GOP-red counties are anti-immigrant, anti-trade, but they don't have trade and immigration. Curious on how you are seeing the access or exposure to environmental pollution in your analysis of political positioning.
I will go back to the kid from Kern County story, which is that we didn't know there was a problem. We really thought that this is just some days of the year you see the mountains and the rest of them you don't, right? And like when I moved away, especially up to a region like Sacramento, and realized that they see the mountains every day, and I'm like, wait a minute, why can't we see the mountains all around Bakersfield except for a couple of days a year? And why is it on the front page of the news when it's like, look at the beautiful mountains around Bakersfield? Like none of us, it didn't even occur that this was a problem. We were in very much an echo chamber of economic dependence. I remember this reporter from Slate was moving to Kern County, and the reason he was moving to Kern County was he said, this is where the just transition is happening and I want to be there. And I'm like, please don't say that in any of the diners in Kern County, because people are going to get real mad, because there's sort of, I don't know if I call it willful ignorance, but there's definitely a sort of when you look at the people in power and what they're not saying it's pollution, right? Like they're saying it's state regulations. That's why your prices are going up. They're saying this and that. And so this is why I come down to power and information saturation, because like we need to get the other message out. So more residents like the ones I work with in Kern who kind of woke up and were like, wait a minute, we don't like the fact that we just had to evacuate out of our home in Arvin for 2 weeks because there was a gas leak near our homes. Like this is the sort of conversation that we need to promote, but there's simply not enough investment happening in those parts of the state that need it the most. So give more money to environmental justice organizations is my takeaway.
Let me just
Join me in
let me-
thanking Ryan, David, and Katie.
Let me just
want to have a
recommend 2 books that might be you can use to answer your question. One is Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Our Own Land, and the other one is brand new from Suzanne Mettler at Cornell Political Scientist called Rural versus Urban. And they both try to tackle this sort of quizzical thing about people not blaming the polluter, but blaming the government.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ellen.